The gun went off before Fannie Morgan even had time to scream. She stood frozen in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street, the afternoon sun hammering down on the back of her neck like a branding iron, watching the man she had trusted with her only secret crumple to his knees in the dust. The crowd that had gathered outside the general store parted like water around a stone, women clutching their shawls, men stepping back with hard eyes and harder silence. And there was Delmore Hatch, the man who owned half of Caldwell, Kansas, standing on the raised boardwalk with a smoking pistol and a smile that made Fanny's blood run cold. "That is what happens," Delmore said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no, to men who meddle in things that do not concern them. The man on his knees was Roy Tanner, the only person in this entire town who had spoken a kind word to Fanny in the 3 weeks since she had arrived. Roy, who had warned her. Roy, who had told her about the trap Delmore had been laying, about the dark past of the man she had been sent to marry, about the hidden motive behind every smile and every forced pleasantry the good citizens of Caldwell had offered her. Roy, who was now pressing one trembling hand against his shoulder while his blood soaked into the dry Kansas earth. Fanny's legs moved before her mind gave them permission. She crossed the street in a fury she had never felt before, dropped to her knees beside Roy, pressed both her hands against his wound, and looked up at Delmore Hatch with eyes that had stopped being afraid. "You shot an unarmed man in front of 30 witnesses," she said. "I shot a thief," Delmore replied calmly, "on my property. Which, as of next Saturday when you marry Clarence, will be your property too, Miss Morgan, so you might want to start understanding which side your bread is buttered on." That was the moment. That exact, irreversible, damning moment when Fannie Morgan understood with absolute clarity that she had walked from one trap directly into another, and that the only question remaining was whether she had the courage, the wit, and the sheer desperate will to find a way out before that Saturday arrived. But to understand why Fannie Morgan was kneeling in the dirt of Caldwell's Main Street on that June afternoon in 1878, pressing her hands against a bleeding man, while a powerful man watched from a boardwalk, you would have to go back 3 weeks, to the morning she stepped off the train with a single carpet bag and the last $14 she owned in the world, and understand that, until that Sunday, she had never felt like she belonged anywhere in town. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a seamstress who drank and a father she had never met. The city had been loud and gray and indifferent, and every neighborhood she had ever lived in had made it clear, through 100 small and cutting ways, that she was a temporary resident and not a true member of anything. She had worked as a laundress, then as a shop girl, then briefly and disastrously as a telegraph operator before the company discovered she was a woman and replaced her with a 17-year-old boy. She had tried church socials and library lending groups, and twice she had accepted invitations to dances that ended with her walking home alone before midnight. St. Louis had never wanted Fannie Morgan. It had tolerated her the way a crowded train tolerates a passenger standing in the aisle. So when the advertisement appeared in the St. Louis Dispatch in early May of 1878, she had read it 4 times before cutting it out with the small scissors she kept in her apron pocket. Respectable woman of good character sought for matrimony by established rancher in Caldwell, Kansas. Generous provision and comfortable home guaranteed. Inquire through the office of Hartwell and Sons, Commercial Street. She had written the letter on a Tuesday, received a reply by Friday, and by the following Monday she was in correspondence with a man named Clarence Hatch, the younger brother of Delmore Hatch, who described himself as a cattle rancher of some success and moderate temperament. His letters were formal and not unkind, though they contained almost nothing personal. He described the house, the acreage, the town. He did not describe himself beyond saying he was 34 years old, in good health, and ready to be married. Fanny had been 26. She was not naive about what a mail-order arrangement was. It was a transaction dressed in the language of companionship. But transactions were honest, and she had been lied to often enough by softer arrangements to prefer the clarity. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday morning in late May, stepping off the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railway line onto a platform that smelled of cattle and creosote. Caldwell in 1878 sat at the very edge of Indian Territory, the southernmost cattle town in Kansas, a place where Texas longhorns moved north in their tens of thousands, and the cowboys who drove them spent their wages fast and loud before turning south again. It was not a gentle town. It had saloons and a jailhouse and a Boot Hill cemetery that was filling faster than the church graveyard. Clarence Hatch had not been at the station to meet her. A man named Willis, who worked at the livery stable, had held a paper sign with her name misspelled on it and driven her in a wagon to the Hatch property 6 miles south of town. Clarence had met her at the door of a solid but charmless 2-story house, shaken her hand, and said, "You are taller than I expected." That was the beginning of their acquaintance. In the first week, Fannie had tried to understand Caldwell the way she had tried to understand every place she had ever lived, by watching carefully and speaking little and waiting for the moment when the place might decide to accept her. She had gone to the dry goods store and the post office and the small lending library that Mrs. Aldous Fenwick kept in the front room of her house on Maple Street. She had attended the Methodist church on Sunday because Clarence had told her it was expected. The women of the Methodist congregation had looked at her with the particular expression that women in small towns reserve for women who have arrived from somewhere else. Not hostile exactly, more like appraisal. She was being measured against a standard she had not been told about and could not guess at. Mrs. Delmore Hatch, whose first name was Bernadette and who wore silk in a town where most women wore calico, had been the most openly appraising of them all. She had taken Fannie's hand in both of hers after the service, smiled with all her teeth, and said, "We have so been looking forward to having you, dear. The Hatch family needs a good woman at its foundation." Fannie had smiled back and said nothing because the word needs had struck her strangely. Not wanted, not welcomes, needs. It was Roy Tanner who had first spoken plainly to her. Roy was the blacksmith's assistant, a lean, weathered man of about 40 with kind eyes and a limp from an old horse fall. He had been shoeing one of the Hatch horses when Fannie came to the livery on her 5th day in Caldwell to ask about hiring a horse for a morning ride. Roy had looked at her for a long moment and then said, quietly, so that Willis at the far end of the stable could not hear, "Miss Morgan, I would be careful about riding out alone on Hatch land if I were you. There are fences you cannot see until you are already on the wrong side of them." She had taken it for a metaphor, because it was delivered in the tone of a metaphor, and she had thought about it for several days before going back to ask him what he meant. By then the second week had passed, and certain things had become clearer in ways that made her restless and uneasy at night. Clarence Hatch was not a cruel man. He was not violent or loud. But he was, Fannie had begun to understand, entirely a creature of his brother's design. He did what Delmore said when Delmore said it, and the arranged marriage was not, as Fannie had been told, the independent decision of a man seeking a companion. It was a strategy. Delmore was in the middle of a land dispute with a neighboring rancher named Aldous Webb, and a marriage by Clarence would establish Clarence's residency and legitimacy on a particular parcel of land that Delmore wanted absorbed into his own holdings. Fannie's name would appear on a deed. Her presence would make Clarence's claim more credible in the county records. She was, in the language of the law, a useful instrument. Roy had told her all of this on a Thursday afternoon in the shade behind the blacksmith's building, his voice low and careful, his eyes watching the street the whole time. He had told her he had worked for Delmore Hatch for 6 years and knew the shape of his plans the way a man knows the shape of the walls of his own prison cell. "Why are you telling me this?" Fannie had asked. "Because you seem like a woman who deserved to be told the truth," Roy had said simply. She had spent the next 4 days thinking. She had not panicked. She was not a woman who panicked easily, because panic had never once solved anything in the life she had led. But she was calculating, quietly and carefully, what her options were. She had $14. She had a ticket that had cost her 30 of the $50 she had saved over 2 years, and there was no one in sight. Louis waiting for her return. Running away was not a simple matter of deciding to run. She needed money, she needed a plan, and she needed, most urgently, a trustworthy ally in a town where trust appeared to be in extremely short supply. She had not yet met Jedediah Whitaker. He had come into her range of awareness the way important things often do, not with fanfare but with a detail that snagged her attention and would not let go. She had been in Aldous Fenwick's lending library, which the town's residents used mostly for almanacs, and occasionally for one of the 3 novels Mrs. Fenwick stocked, when she heard his voice through the half-open window that faced the alley. He was talking to his horse, she realized, not in the performative way some men do, but in a genuine, easy, conversational way that suggested he found his horse to be an adequate audience. "I know you are tired," he was saying. "I am tired too, but there is a trough 30 feet from here and then I will find you some proper feed. I did not say it would be easy. I said it would be worth it. There is a difference." Fannie had looked out the window. The man below was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and trailed dust on every surface of him. He was leading a dark bay horse with the careful attentiveness of a man who understood that animals feel everything their handlers feel. He looked up, not because he had sensed her watching, but because he was simply a man who tended to look up, and their eyes met for a moment before he touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers and moved on. She had asked Mrs. Fenwick about him the next morning. "Jedediah Whitaker," Mrs. Fenwick had said, in the tone people use for someone they are not entirely sure how to categorize. "He has a small ranch about 8 miles east of town. Came here 4 years ago from somewhere in Tennessee, I believe. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes into town on Sundays for the service and supplies. A decent man, people say, though he is not a man Delmore Hatch has much use for." "Why not?" Fannie had asked. "Because decent men make Delmore uncomfortable," Mrs. Fenwick had said, and then seemed to realize she had said more than she intended and changed the subject. The Sunday after Roy was shot in the street was a Sunday that Fannie would remember for the rest of her life. She had spent the 2 days since the shooting in a state of controlled, combustible fury that she kept carefully banked behind a composed exterior, because losing her composure in Delmore Hatch's world would accomplish nothing except making her a more obvious target. Roy had been taken to the doctor's house, the bullet removed, and Delmore had not been arrested or even formally questioned, because the sheriff of Caldwell at that time was a man named Foster who owed Delmore Hatch $300 he could not repay. Clarence had told Fannie that evening that the wedding would proceed as planned on Saturday. He had said it looking at the floor, not at her, and she had understood that he was not entirely comfortable with the situation, but that his discomfort was not going to result in any action on his part. She had said, "Of course," and gone to bed and stared at the ceiling until sometime past midnight, formulating the beginning of a plan that was more hope than architecture. On Sunday she put on her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that was entirely too hot for Kansas in June, but was the only thing she owned that gave her the feeling of being armored, and she walked the 6 miles into town because she had decided that arriving in a Hatch wagon with a Hatch driver was no longer something she was willing to do. The walk took her an hour and 40 minutes in the morning heat, and she arrived at the Methodist church with dust on her boots and sweat at her temples, and a look on her face that made the deacon step back slightly when he handed her a hymnal. She sat in the back pew because the Hatch family sat in the front, and she needed distance from them to think. The minister was delivering a sermon about community, about the bonds that held towns together, about the obligations citizens owed one another, and Fannie listened with part of her mind, while the other part watched the congregation, and specifically watched the third pew from the back on the left side. where Jedediah Whitaker sat with his hat on his knee and his dark eyes forward, and his jaw set with the particular expression of a man who takes Sunday service seriously and is not performing the taking of it. She had her plan sketched out before the final hymn. It was not a good plan. It was desperate and presumptuous, and rested almost entirely on a judgment of a man's character. She had formed largely from watching him talk to a horse through a window and hearing second-hand opinions about him. But desperate situations generate desperate architectures, and hers was what it was. She waited outside after the service, standing apart from the cluster of congregants who moved in familiar social orbits around each other, and when Jedediah Whitaker came through the door and put his hat on and started toward the hitching post where his dark bay was tied, she stepped directly into his path. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "my name is Fannie Morgan. I believe you need to hear something important, and I believe I need to tell it to you, and I think we have about 30 seconds before Delmore Hatch notices I am speaking to you. So with your permission, I will be brief and direct." He stopped. He looked at her with dark eyes that were, she noted, entirely free of the wariness she had expected and full instead of a frank, assessing attention. "All right, Miss Morgan," he said. "I was brought to this town under false pretenses to be used as a legal instrument in Delmore Hatch's land scheme. I do not intend to cooperate. I need help getting free of the situation before Saturday, and I have been told that you are a decent man who has no interest in being useful to Delmore Hatch. I am aware that asking a stranger for help of this nature is an extraordinary thing. I am asking anyway." For a moment he said nothing. The Sunday crowd moved around them, the smell of horse and dust, and the distant low chorus of cattle drifting on the warm air. "You walked all the way from the Hatch property," he said. It was not a question. He had seen her boots. "Yes," she said, "that is about 6 miles. I am aware. And you came to church and waited, and now you are asking me, a man you have never spoken to, for help." "Yes," Fannie said, "I am." "All right," Jedediah Whitaker said, "I will help you." She had expected more resistance than that. She had prepared several arguments for why he should trust her, and she did not get to use a single one of them. He simply said it, quietly and without drama, with the flat certainty of a man making a decision he is not planning to revisit. Delmore Hatch had, in fact, noticed. He was watching from across the churchyard, with an expression that had not yet become openly hostile, but was moving in that direction at an observable rate. "I think we should not stand here any longer," Jedediah said, and he touched her elbow very lightly, just a brush of guidance, and they walked together toward his horse, talking quietly with their faces angled toward each other in a way that anyone watching might have interpreted as casual conversation rather than the revolutionary act it actually was. He helped her onto his horse without asking, simply cupped his hands and waited for her foot, and swung up behind her, and they rode out of the churchyard at a pace that was unhurried and therefore unalarming to anyone watching who did not know what was actually happening. She felt the warmth of him at her back and the steadiness of his presence, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her given the urgency of the moment, that this was possibly the first time in her 26 years that she had ever felt like she was being held rather than managed. They rode east, away from Caldwell and toward the open grassland, until the church spire was small behind them, and the only sound was wind through the buffalo grass and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. "Tell me everything," Jedediah said. She told him. She told him about the advertisement and the letters and the house and Clarence's passivity and Delmore's power, and the land dispute with Aldous Webb and Roy Tanner's warning and Roy Tanner's shooting, and the deed that was going to have her name on it and the sheriff who owed money and the 6 days left before Saturday. He listened without interrupting. That alone was extraordinary to her. In her experience, men interrupted. They offered solutions before they had heard problems. Jedediah Whitaker listened to the entire thing and then was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "The land dispute with Aldous Webb," he said. "That is the engine of this. If Delmore gets that parcel legally established in Clarence's name through this marriage, he absorbs it, but Webb has a legitimate claim. I have seen the original survey records. They were filed in Sumner County Court in 1874, and Webb's line is correct. How do you know this? Fannie asked. Because 2 years ago, Delmore tried to do the same thing to me, Jedediah said. He wanted the water rights on the East Creek that runs through the edge of my property. He approached me first with money, then with threats, then he tried to file a false claim in the county records. I spent 4 months and more money than I had proving the original survey correct. And you won. I won, he said. Which is why Delmore Hatch has no use for me, as I believe you have been told. She turned her head slightly and looked at his profile against the open sky, the straight nose and the clean line of his jaw and the eyes that were fixed on the middle distance with an expression she was beginning to read as his version of concentration. Why did you say yes? She asked. Just like that. You do not know me. I know enough, he said. I know you walked 6 miles in the heat in a wool dress and stood in a churchyard and asked a stranger for help, instead of running or crying or simply going along with what you were told to do. That tells me more about your character than a month of acquaintance would. Fannie felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she was not accustomed to and could not immediately identify, something between the warmth of gratitude and something less categorizable. They rode the rest of the way to his ranch in something that was not quite silence but was quieter than conversation, a comfortable shared awareness that felt to Fannie, who had almost no experience of comfort in shared spaces, entirely foreign and entirely natural at once. His ranch was modest by Hatch standards but clean and well kept, a single-story house of good timber with a broad porch and a substantial barn, and a kitchen garden that had clearly been tended with genuine care. She registered all of it in the way she registered everything, quickly and practically, because her mind was on the 6 days she had and the steps that would need to fill them. He made coffee on the iron stove in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried sage, and they sat at a table that was scarred from use but scrubbed clean, and they began to plan. The key thing, Jedediah said, is the deed. If we can demonstrate to the county clerk that the proposed marriage is being conducted under fraudulent pretenses, and that Fannie's signature on any property document would be obtained under duress, Delmore loses his legal instrument. But we need the original survey documents, and we need someone with standing to present them to the Sumner County Court before Saturday. Who has standing? Fannie asked. Aldous Webb. He is the injured party. And there is a territorial judge named Beaumont who comes through Caldwell every 6 weeks. He is due on Thursday. That is 4 days from now. Yes. Can we reach Aldous Webb in 4 days? He lives 12 miles south. I can ride there tomorrow morning. Fannie wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and thought. Delmore will know something is happening before Thursday. He saw us speaking today. He is not a man who waits to see how things develop. No, Jedediah agreed. He is not. Which means there will be consequences before Thursday that we need to be prepared for. There will be, Jedediah said. What consequences are you willing to accept? She looked at him directly. I am willing to accept any consequence that does not include marrying Clarence Hatch and having my name put on a fraudulent deed. He nodded once, with the gravity of a man who has heard a line drawn and respects it absolutely. Then we have a plan. She did not go back to the Hatch house that night. She was not safe there, not now that Delmore had seen her with Jedediah, and both of them knew it without having to say it explicitly. Jedediah set up a cot in the back room that served as a combination storeroom and sleeping space for the ranch hand he had let go the previous winter when money had been tight, and he gave her a blanket and a candle and said good night with a formality that she found, in her current state of exhausted anxiety, unexpectedly touching. She lay in the narrow cot and listened to the Kansas night through the single window, the chorus of insects, and the distant moan of cattle and the occasional lonely sound of wind, and thought that even in this uncertain and dangerous situation she felt more at ease than she had felt in 3 weeks in Clarence Hatch's comfortable, trap-laden house. She thought about Jedediah Whitaker saying, "I will help you," with no hesitation and no qualification and no visible calculation of what it would cost him. She thought about his hands on the coffee cup, broad and capable and unhurried. She told herself firmly that there was an extremely important and dangerous practical problem to be solved in the next 4 days, and that the situation called for clarity and focus, and not for the kind of distracted warmth that was currently trying to establish itself in the middle of her chest. The warmth was not deterred by this instruction. The next morning Jedediah rode south to find Aldous Webb before dawn, leaving Fannie with instructions on where the food was, where the rifle was, and the information that his nearest neighbor, a widow named Martha Crane who lived 2 miles west, was a woman of sound judgment and good heart who could be trusted in an emergency. Fannie spent the morning doing something that felt almost revolutionary in the context of the past 3 weeks. She cooked breakfast, she swept the porch, she assessed the kitchen garden and pulled weeds for an hour in the warming sun, and she felt the particular satisfaction that comes from doing simple, useful things in a space that does not feel hostile. She thought about the fact that she had never in her adult life swept a porch that was in any sense hers, that every domestic act she had ever performed had been in service of a landlord's property or an employer's space, or most recently, a trap. There was something different about the way her hands moved on the broom handle when the porch was one where she had been genuinely welcomed. She was replanting a section of the bean rows that had been flattened by the previous day's wind when she heard horses on the road. Not one horse, several. She stood up and turned, and coming down the road from the direction of Caldwell were 3 men she recognized. The man in the lead was not Delmore himself, but his foreman, a large and unpleasant man named Dutch Carver, who had been at the shooting of Roy Tanner, and had watched it with the flat approval of a man who views violence as a management tool. Behind Dutch were 2 riders she did not know by name but whose expressions were those of men with instructions. Fannie walked to the porch, opened the door, went to where Jedediah had told her the rifle was, a Winchester model 1873, and checked that it was loaded, which it was, and then walked back to the porch and stood with the rifle held across her body in a way that was not pointed at anyone, but was not casual either. Dutch Carver pulled up his horse 20 feet from the porch and looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who had expected less resistance. "Miss Morgan," he said, "Mr. Hatch would like you to come back to the house. Your presence here is causing him some concern." "I am sure it is," Fannie said. "Tell Mr. Hatch that I am not currently in need of his concern. That is not an answer he is going to accept. Then perhaps he should come ask the question himself if he is comfortable doing so." Dutch Carver looked at the rifle. He looked at the 2 men behind him. He looked at the open country around Whitaker's ranch, which did not contain, as far as he could see, the man who owned it, and which did contain a woman who appeared to be entirely prepared to have a conversation about it. "You do not want to make an enemy of Delmore Hatch, Miss Morgan," Dutch said. "Mr. Carver," Fannie said, "Delmore Hatch made an enemy of me when he sent Roy Tanner's blood into the street. I would suggest you take that message back to him." There was a long moment in which the air between them was extremely full of unspoken things. Then Dutch Carver turned his horse around and the 3 men rode back toward Caldwell at a pace that communicated both retreat and the clear implication that retreat was temporary. Fannie lowered the rifle and sat down on the porch steps and discovered that her hands were shaking slightly, which she found irritating and somewhat beneath her. She gripped the rifle stock and waited for the shaking to stop, and when it did, she went back to the bean rows, because there was nothing else to do and idle waiting was worse than useful work. Jedediah came back in the late afternoon with Aldous Webb. Aldous Webb was a weathered man of 50, with the look of someone who had been fighting battles for so long that fighting had become his natural posture. He dismounted in front of the barn and shook Fannie's hand with the grip of a man who respects the person he is meeting, and then said, "I have the original survey documents, all of them. I have had them in a tin box buried under my kitchen floor since 1875 because I knew Delmore Hatch would eventually come for them." "You knew this was coming," Fannie said. "I have been expecting it for 3 years," Webb said. "I just did not expect it to take this particular shape." Jedediah had already explained the main elements to Webb on the ride, and now the three of them sat at the kitchen table with the survey documents spread out between them, the lamp lit against the evening dark, planning what Thursday would need to look like. It was while they were talking that Fannie noticed the way Jedediah moved around the table to stand beside her when he was looking at a document, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and not entirely unlike the way he had been on horseback that morning, close and steady, and not requiring anything from her. She noticed it and set it aside and kept her attention on the documents. Webb left before full dark, riding south with his survey papers wrapped in oilcloth, and the understanding that he would ride to meet Judge Beaumont's party on the Wichita Road first thing Thursday morning, and escort him into Caldwell himself. When he was gone, Jedediah made supper, salt pork and beans and cornbread from a cast-iron skillet, and they ate at the table in the lamplight and talked. Not about the plan, not about Delmore Hatch, not about Saturday. They talked about other things, the way people who are being careful about larger matters sometimes talk about smaller ones, as if to prove to themselves that smaller matters still exist. He told her about Tennessee, about the farm where he had grown up and the brother who still ran it, and the particular quality of light in the evenings there that he had never found anywhere else and had stopped looking for. She told him about St. Louis, about the telegraph office job and the 17-year-old boy who had replaced her, and how she had felt less angry about the replacement than about the way it had been done, without apology or acknowledgement, as if she had never been there at all. "That is the hardest kind of injustice," he said, "not the loud ones, the ones where they act as if you were never there." She looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." They talked for a long time in the lamplight, until the candle had burned down significantly, and the night outside had deepened from purple to black, and Fannie was aware, at some point that she could not pinpoint precisely, that the conversation had shifted from two people conducting a strategic alliance into two people who were simply talking because they wanted to keep talking. She went to bed in the storeroom, and Jedediah went to his room, and the house settled around them with the particular quiet of a building that contains two people who are each lying awake thinking about the same thing from different directions. The next 2 days were a sustained exercise in the management of danger. Delmore Hatch sent Dutch Carver back Tuesday morning with a formal written message demanding Fannie's return to the Hatch property, invoking the betrothal agreement, and suggesting that Jedediah Whitaker was harboring a woman against her will. Jedediah sent back a written response noting that Miss Morgan was present of her own volition, and that any document suggesting otherwise was welcome to be tested in court, where court would also be an excellent place to test the particulars of the betrothal arrangement itself. On Tuesday afternoon, Clarence Hatch came alone, which surprised both Fannie and Jedediah. He came without Dutch and without riders, just himself on a plain brown horse, and he tied the horse at the fence and came to the porch with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is carrying a weight he did not choose and cannot put down. "Fannie," he said. He was the first person in Caldwell who had ever used her first name without being invited to, but there was nothing predatory in it. It was just tired and human. "Clarence," she said. "I am not going to ask you to come back," he said. "I want you to know that. I am asking something else." She waited. "I want you to know that I did not tell you the truth in my letters. I told you what Delmore told me to tell you. I knew it was not right. I knew it before you came, and I knew it more clearly after you arrived." He turned his hat in his hands around and around. "I am sorry for that. I know that is an inadequate thing to say. Fannie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clarence, do you want to marry me?" He looked at her with an expression that was almost relieved. "No," he said, "I do not like this. Not for this." "Then tell that to Judge Beaumont on Thursday," she said. "That testimony from you about the real purpose of this arrangement will be more powerful than the survey documents alone." He was silent for a long moment. She watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of loyalty to his brother against some older, quieter obligation to something more fundamental. It was a real struggle, and she did not minimize it. "Delmore is not a man who forgives," Clarence said finally. "No," she agreed. "But you will have to live with yourself considerably longer than you will have to live with Delmore's anger." He put his hat back on. He looked at Jedediah, who had been standing at the edge of the porch through this whole conversation in the careful way of a man who understands when his presence is support and when it would be interference. Jedediah looked back at him steadily. "All right," Clarence said. He mounted his horse and rode back toward town and the house where his brother's plans were currently collapsing around the edges. That evening, Jedediah and Fannie sat on the porch in the last of the daylight, watching the Kansas sky do what it did in June, turning through shades of orange and rose and deep violet in a display that was almost offensive in its beauty given the circumstances. Fannie had her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she was aware that she had been sitting very close to Jedediah on the bench, and that neither of them had moved away from the fact of it. "What will you do?" Jedediah said carefully. "After Thursday?" "It was the way we hope." "I do not know," Fannie said honestly. "I cannot go back to St. Louis. I spent everything I had on the ticket west, and I cannot stay in Caldwell under Delmore Hatch's shadow." "You could stay in Caldwell under its own shadow," he said, "which is considerably lighter." She looked at him. The violet light was on his face, and his expression was the same one she had seen in the churchyard, frank and assessing, and entirely free of the protective opacity that most people wore. "That is a generous thing to say," she said carefully. "It is a true thing to say," he said. "I am not in the habit of saying things because they are generous." She felt the warmth in her chest that she had been putting instructions to since Sunday, and which had been entirely failing to respond to instructions. And she thought that she could continue to maintain the careful discipline of a woman who has been burned by soft things, and decided they were too costly. Or she could acknowledge that something real was happening here between two people in a lamplit house on the Kansas plain, and perhaps the discipline had served its purpose and could rest. "I did not come here looking for anything except a way out," she said. "I know that," he said. "I want you to understand that what I feel is not gratitude. I am aware that what I feel could be interpreted as gratitude, and I want to tell you that it is not. Gratitude and this are different things." He was very still. "What things do you feel, Fannie?" he said, and the use of her name in that voice with that particular quietness was the most intimate thing anyone had said to her in years. She took a breath. "I feel as if I am talking to someone who is actually there," she said. "I have been talking to rooms for most of my life. People who were there in body but not in any way that registered. And you are there. You are entirely there. And that is the most startling and disorienting and entirely welcome thing I have experienced in longer than I can calculate." In the long silence that followed, she watched the last of the violet drain from the sky, and the first stars appear with the sharp clarity that only existed far from cities. And then Jedediah put his hand over hers on the bench and left it there, warm and deliberate and unhurried. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat on the porch until full dark, holding hands, and did not need to say anything more about it. Thursday morning arrived with a sky full of high white cloud and the smell of coming rain. Jedediah was up before dawn saddling horses, and Fannie dressed in the blue wool dress again, because it was still the best thing she had, and because she was going to court today in a sense if not in the most formal way, and she wanted to be armored. They rode into Caldwell together, side by side, arriving at the hour when the town was fully awake but not yet at its loudest, and they went directly to the courthouse, which was a modest two-story building on the main street that served as both City Hall and the space where the circuit judge heard cases when he came through. Aldous Webb was already there, standing outside with his survey documents under his arm, and a man Jedediah identified as Judge Beaumont, a compact, silver-haired man with sharp eyes who looked like he had heard a great many attempts to deceive him, and had developed an immunity to all of them. With Webb were two other ranchers, men who had had their own small and grinding conflicts with Delmore Hatch over the years and who had come, Webb said, to provide testimony of a pattern of behavior. Clarence Hatch arrived 20 minutes later, alone, and shook nobody's hand, and stood to one side with the expression of a man who has made a decision he intends to live with and is not enjoying the moment of making it. Delmore Hatch arrived with Dutch Carver, and a lawyer from Wichita he had clearly sent for urgently, and who looked unhappy about the speed with which he had been required to travel. Delmore looked at the assembled faces and did the calculation fast, the way smart men do, and the calculation clearly came out in a direction he had not anticipated, because for a moment something behind his confident expression flickered. He looked at Fannie. She looked back at him with the same steady, unafraid expression she had used when she had told Dutch Carver to deliver her message. He looked at Jedediah beside her. Something in that look hardened. "Whitaker," he said. "Hatch," Jedediah said, with exactly the same intonation, giving nothing and taking nothing. The proceedings with Judge Beaumont were not a formal trial, but a preliminary examination that Beaumont had the authority to conduct under Kansas territorial law when presented with a request for injunctive relief in property matters. He was methodical and unimpressed by Delmore's lawyer's objections, and he listened to Webb's survey documents with the close attention of a man who understands land law and can see the shape of fraud when it is laid out in front of him. Clarence Hatch's testimony was the decisive element. He stood in front of Judge Beaumont and said, in a flat and steady voice, that the marriage arrangement had been made at his brother's direction for the specific purpose of establishing a legal residential claim to the disputed land parcel, that Miss Morgan had not been informed of this purpose, and that he himself was withdrawing his consent to the arrangement. Delmore Hatch stood very still during this testimony. His expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness was the stillness of a man in whom something fundamental was occurring that he was choosing not to show. Beaumont issued the injunction against the property transfer before noon, suspended the betrothal agreement as executed under fraudulent pretenses, and noted for the record that the matter of the shooting of one Roy Tanner on public property, which Webb had raised as additional context for the pattern of behavior, would be referred to the county prosecutor in Wichita. It was over in 3 hours. Fannie stood on the steps of the courthouse in the noon light with the documents that had freed her in one hand and Jedediah Whitaker standing beside her, and she felt something she did not have clean language for, a quality of air around her that she had not felt before, as if the town had been a container she had been pressing against from the inside, and the container had suddenly expanded. Delmore Hatch came down the courthouse steps and stopped in front of them. His lawyer was already walking away toward the hotel, his usefulness exhausted. Dutch Carver hung back at a careful distance. Delmore looked at Jedediah. "You have made an enemy today," he said. "I had one already," Jedediah said. "It has not inconvenienced me much." Delmore looked at Fannie. Something moved across his face that was not quite what she expected. It was not rage and it was not cold contempt. It was something closer to a man who has genuinely miscalculated and knows it and cannot yet determine what to do with that knowledge. "You are a harder woman than I took you for, Miss Morgan," he said. "Most women are harder than you take them for, Mr. Hatch," she said. "I suspect that is a lesson you will continue to relearn." He walked past them and down the street, and it was not the exit of a man who had won, but it was also not entirely the exit of a man who was done. Fannie watched him go and filed the knowledge that this was not the last of it, though the shape of what was still to come was different now and much more manageable. Roy Tanner was recovering at the doctor's house, and when Fannie went to see him that afternoon, he was sitting up with his arm in a sling and a cup of soup balanced on his knee, looking more alive than she had feared. "You did it," he said when he saw her face. "We did it," she said. "You did most of it months ago when you decided to tell a stranger the truth." He smiled at her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done a right thing and had it matter. "Jedediah Whitaker," he said. "You went to Jedediah." "I did." "Good," Roy said, with the emphatic simplicity of a man summing up a complicated situation. The question of where Fannie Morgan was going to live was answered not with a dramatic conversation, but with a natural, gradual shifting of circumstances over the 2 weeks that followed. She stayed at Jedediah's ranch because there was nowhere else that was both safe and practical, and because being there felt increasingly like something she was choosing rather than something she had defaulted to. She worked in the kitchen garden and in the house, and helped with the horses in the way that someone helps who has taken a genuine proprietary interest in a place. And Jedediah worked beside her or near her, or across the table from her in the evenings. And the ranch began to feel less like a temporary shelter, and more like somewhere a life could be built. Caldwell accommodated this development with the ambivalence typical of small towns in 1878, where the arrival of a single woman on the property of a single man was subject to scrutiny that a different arrangement would not have generated. Mrs. Fenwick at the lending library was kind and discreet. The minister at the Methodist church was more formally concerned, and visited on a Tuesday to discuss the proprieties, a conversation that Jedediah handled with a calm directness that left the minister with nothing to formally object to, and a general sense that things were moving toward a conventional conclusion that he simply had not yet been officially informed about. He was not wrong. 3 weeks after Thursday at the courthouse, on a Sunday morning that was clear and golden and smelled of cured grass, and the first slight hint of autumn on the western wind, Jedediah Whitaker asked Fannie Morgan to marry him. He did it the way he did most things, without excessive ceremony and without performative hesitation, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in one hand and the other hand gripping the edge of the table as if he needed a small anchor. "I have been thinking about the right way to say this," he said, "and I have concluded that there is not a particularly right way, and that being direct is always better than being elaborate." "I tend to agree," Fannie said. "I want to marry you. Not because of the situation or the circumstances, or anything that has to do with Hatch or the land, or the events of the last month. I want to marry you because being in the same room with you is the most interesting and the most comfortable I have ever been, and I cannot identify a reason to have less of that when I could arrange to have more of it." Fannie put down her spoon. She looked at him standing there in the kitchen light with his coffee cup and his earnestness and the slight tension in his jaw that told her this was not as easy to say as he was making it sound, and she felt the fullness of it, the real and specific weight of being seen and chosen by a person who had seen her first and chosen her second and not the other way around. "Yes," she said, "I want that too." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, and she let him and leaned into it, and felt the warmth that had been building in her chest since that first Sunday finally settle into something permanent and foundational. They were married on the second Saturday of August in 1878 in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with a service conducted by the minister who was somewhat surprised to find his informal Tuesday prediction confirmed so quickly. Mrs. Fenwick was there, and Martha Crane, who was Jedediah's nearest neighbor and had become a genuine friend to Fannie in the intervening weeks. Roy Tanner came with his arm still in its sling and sat in the second pew and cried quietly and seemed entirely unembarrassed about doing so. Aldous Webb came with 2 of his ranch hands and shook Jedediah's hand for a long time afterward with the grip of a man transferring something weightier than congratulation. Clarence Hatch was not there. He had left Caldwell 2 weeks after the courthouse hearing and gone, according to Mrs. Fenwick, to relatives in Missouri. There was a general sense in the community that the departure was more liberation than exile, though no one said so loudly. Delmore Hatch was still in Caldwell. The county prosecutor's referral regarding Roy Tanner's shooting had produced an investigation that was slow but moving, and Delmore was occupying himself with the management of his substantial and somewhat reduced interests, with the focused energy of a man recalibrating after a significant reverse. He did not attend the wedding, and no one expected him to. The wedding itself was everything that Fannie's life up to that point had been so specifically short of. Simple and genuine, and surrounded by people who had chosen to be there rather than who had been placed there by circumstance. She stood at the front of the church in a dress that Martha Crane had helped her make from blue cotton, a better shade of blue than the wool and lighter, and she looked at Jedediah standing across from her and said her vows in a clear voice that did not shake at all. He said his vows looking directly at her, unhurried, as if the words were ones he had always known and was finally saying in the right direction. When the minister pronounced them married and Jedediah kissed her in the warm light of the church with the small congregation rustling and smiling behind them, Fannie felt the absolute concrete settling of a thing that had been in motion for a long time and had arrived exactly where it should. The reception, such as it was held in the open space behind the church with tables. Mrs. Fenwick and Martha Crane had loaded with food that people had brought in the generous way of communities that are, at their best, capable of genuine welcome. There was cold chicken and fresh bread, and 3 kinds of pie, and a small barrel of beer that one of Webb's ranch hands had brought without being asked. There was a fiddle player who appeared to be either a friend of Roy Tanner's or a stranger who had detected a celebration and attached himself to it, and he played in a corner with the unself-conscious ease of someone who plays for the love of it. Fannie sat at a table with Jedediah and Martha and Roy, and ate food she had not prepared herself, and listened to people talk around her with the particular quality of attention she always brought to new experiences of community. But this was different from the church social scrutiny of the first week, different from the appraising smiles of Bernadette Hatch. This was people being genuinely easy in each other's company and finding room for her in it, not as an evaluated candidate but simply as a person at a table who was welcome there. She said this to Jedediah quietly, leaning close to him, and he squeezed her hand under the table and said, "You have been welcome here for a while. You are only now able to feel it." She thought about that for a moment. "I think you might be right," she said. "I am occasionally right," he agreed. She laughed, which was a sound she had been making more frequently in the past month than in the year before it, and he looked at her with the expression she was learning to recognize as the one he wore when something had delighted him unexpectedly, a private brightness that was not for anyone else in the room. In the months that followed the wedding, Caldwell continued its slow, uneven, difficult process of becoming a more lawful place, as all the cattle towns of Kansas were doing through the late 1870s under the combined pressure of homesteader organization and the slow extension of formal legal structures. The county prosecutor's investigation of Delmore Hatch took 9 months and eventually resulted in Delmore paying a substantial settlement to Roy Tanner and receiving a formal censure that, while not a criminal conviction, marked the end of his unchallenged reign over the town's affairs. He remained in Caldwell, but as a diminished figure, the way powerful men sometimes remain in places where they are no longer powerful because leaving would be an admission they cannot make. Roy Tanner recovered fully from the shooting and went back to work at the livery stable, and eventually, in the spring of 1879, he bought into the blacksmith operation as a partner, a development that Fannie found satisfying on multiple levels. Aldous Webb won his land case in Sumner County Court in the autumn of 1878, the survey document securing his claim against any further challenge. He and Jedediah developed what the community recognized as a genuine friendship, 2 men who had each defended something important and come out the other side with their principles intact and a proper appreciation for what that cost. Jedediah and Fannie's ranch grew in the first year of their marriage by two things. The first was a young ranch hand named Thomas, 17 years old and freshly arrived from Ohio with nothing but a horse of questionable soundness and a willingness to work that more than compensated for his inexperience. Jedediah hired him for wages, and Thomas repaid this in a year of increasingly competent labor and a loyalty that had the quality of something that had been looking for somewhere to be directed. The second thing the ranch grew by was a child. Fannie told Jedediah on a November evening in 1878, sitting by the iron stove with the wind pressing at the windows and the lamp lit against the early dark. She told him in the direct way she did everything, without preamble, and watched his face go through a sequence of things, surprise and something overwhelming, and then a quietness that was not equanimity, but was something she understood to be a man feeling something very large and not yet having the language for it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he got up from his chair and crouched down in front of hers and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with the dark eyes that she had come to know in all their gradations. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. "A little," she said. "Not about the child itself, about whether I will know what to do. I did not have a great deal in the way of instruction for this." "Neither did I," he said. "I suppose we will figure it out." "I suspect that is what most people say," Fannie said, "and what most people do." "Then we will be in good company," he said, and brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them. The boy was born in June of 1879, which gave him and his parents the distinction of arriving in Kansas 1 year apart in the same month. They named him Samuel after Jedediah's father, who had been a good man and was no longer living. And Samuel Whitaker arrived in the world in the bedroom of the ranch house with Martha Crane in attendance as midwife, and with a quality of loud and unambiguous announcement that suggested he intended to be clearly heard from the beginning. Jedediah held him with the careful, overwhelmed tenderness of a man who has never held a baby, and is discovering that the size of the feeling is inversely proportional to the size of the person generating it. Fannie, who was exhausted and entirely satisfied and watching her husband hold her son in the lamplight, felt something that she did not try to put words to because no words were adequate. It was simply the full weight of a life that had arrived at itself, the particular completion of a person who had spent a long time walking in directions that felt arbitrary and had finally found the direction that felt true. Summer became autumn and autumn became winter, and Samuel grew with the methodical purposefulness of babies, which is to say he grew constantly and in all directions and demanded an attention that reorganized the ranch's rhythms around itself with complete indifference to what they had previously been. Thomas, the ranch hand, discovered that he had a gift for making the baby stop crying that he could not explain, and that Jedediah declared to be worth more than his wages. The second summer, 1880, brought changes to Caldwell that had been visible on the horizon. The cattle drives that had defined the town were beginning to shift west as homesteader pressure closed the old trail routes, and Caldwell was becoming less a cattle town and more a settled community with the ambitions and the conflicts that settled communities carry. New families arrived, new businesses opened, and the community that had felt, during Fannie's first weeks there, like an organism governed by Delmore Hatch's singular will was diversifying into something more complex and more genuinely communal. Mrs. Fenwick expanded her lending library into a proper room added to the house by her son, and asked Fannie if she would help run it 2 mornings a week, an offer that Fannie accepted with a quiet pleasure that she recognized as something specific. The pleasure of being asked for something because of a quality you actually possess rather than a function you can perform. She spent those 2 mornings a week among books and the people of Caldwell who came for books, and she found that the town, approached now from a position of genuine belonging rather than anxious provisional membership, was a more interesting and more generous place than she had first experienced it as. The women who had appraised her in the first weeks of her arrival became simply women she knew, complicated and various and often kind. The minister who had come to discuss proprieties became a man she had Sunday conversations with about scripture and local history. The town became, gradually and without ceremony, hers. She thought about this sometimes, about the extraordinary improbability of it. She had arrived with $14 and a fear she did not show, and a plan that was more desperation than design. And somehow from that frail beginning had come this. This house, this man, this boy who was now 2 years old and could say horse with a precision that made his father visibly emotional, this town that had room for her in it. She said something of this to Jedediah one evening in the second autumn, sitting on the porch in the hour before the light went, with Samuel asleep inside, and the Kansas sky doing its violet and rose performance and the smell of cured grass on the air. "I never expected any of this," she said. "I do not mean that in the way people say it when they mean they feel lucky. I mean it literally. I had no architecture for this. I did not know how to imagine it." "Because you had not been shown it was possible," Jedediah said. "No," she said, "I had not." "Neither had I," he said. "If it helps." She looked at him. "It does," she said, "considerably." He put his arm around her on the bench, and she leaned into it the way she had learned to lean into the presence of him, not as dependency, but as the simple physics of two things that fit well together naturally occupying the space they fit in. The autumn of 1880 brought one more piece of the past's business to a close. The county prosecutor's office in Wichita issued a final finding in the matter of Delmore Hatch and Roy Tanner, levying the settlement, and with it came a related finding that had been slower to develop, a formal invalidation of several land claims that Delmore had filed through fraudulent survey amendments over the preceding decade. 3 families who had been displaced or constrained by those claims received restorations of their original property rights. It was not complete justice, which is to say it did not reach everyone who had been harmed, and it did not undo all the years of suppression, but it was more than many of those affected had allowed themselves to hope for. Fannie attended the public meeting in Caldwell where these findings were announced, sitting beside Jedediah and across the table from Aldous Webb, and listened to the county official read out the names and the restored claims with a satisfaction that was not triumphant, but was deep and steady and real. Delmore Hatch sat at the back of the room and listened with his face in the expression she had come to understand as his default when he was losing. He left before the meeting finished, and there was, for the first time, no Dutch Carver walking behind him. Dutch had left Caldwell in the spring for somewhere further west, the way men like Dutch tend to do when the place they have been working loses the qualities that made their particular skills useful. Roy Tanner, who was sitting near the front with his arm fully healed and a look of immense permanent satisfaction, caught Fannie's eye across the room and nodded once. She nodded back. They had never needed to speak very much to each other to communicate what was essential. In the spring of 1881, Samuel Whitaker discovered that horses would stand still for him in the corral if he moved slowly and held his hand out flat and talked to them, and spent approximately 3 weeks communicating this discovery to anyone who would listen. Jedediah watched this development with an expression that was pure love dressed in restraint, and Fannie watched Jedediah watching and felt the accumulation of it, the specific richness of a life that has become populated with these small saturating moments that have no drama but are the actual substance of things. She thought often about the woman she had been on that first Wednesday in Caldwell, stepping off the train with the carpet bag and the $14 and the hard-learned wariness, and about how that woman had moved through the town in those first weeks like someone pressing her face against glass, able to see the warmth of people's lives but unable to enter it. She thought about how close she had come to accepting that condition as permanent, as simply the shape her life had and would always have. She thought about the Sunday she had stood in the churchyard and walked directly into the path of a man she did not know, and asked him for help she had no right to ask for. She thought about the way he had said yes. There was a day in that second spring, a Sunday in April of 1881, when she was walking back from the lending library through the center of Caldwell with Samuel on her hip and the afternoon light lying long and gold across the street. And she passed the hardware store and the post office and the church and the livery, and she thought, with a startlement that was not entirely comfortable, that she knew this street. She knew it the way you know streets that are yours, that you have walked in different weathers and different moods, that have held the days of your life, and therefore belong to you and you to them. She stopped walking for a moment outside the church and looked down the length of the main street, at the buildings and the people moving between them and the ordinary Thursday afternoon busyness of a town going about its life, and she felt something she had never felt before in any street of any town she had ever lived in. She felt as if she belonged here, not because the town was perfect, because it was not. Not because everyone in it was kind or just or free of the prejudices and small cruelties of their time, because they were none of those things entirely, but because she had come to know it and be known by it, and because the people in it who mattered to her were here, and because the life she was building was being built in this specific place and nowhere else, and that specificity had become her own. Samuel pulled at her collar and said something that was approximately hoarse, because at 18 months most things were approximately hoarse, and she shifted him on her hip and kept walking toward home. Jedediah was in the barn when she arrived, talking to the dark bay in the way she had first heard him do through Mrs. Fenwick's window, easy and genuine, and she stood in the barn door with the child on her hip and the afternoon light behind her, and watched him for a moment before he heard her and turned. He looked at her in the door with the light behind her, and his face did the thing it did, the thing she had not had a word for at first and now called, internally and without self-consciousness, home. "Samuel has been saying horse for the last hour," she said. "He has excellent priorities," Jedediah said. She crossed the barn to him, and he took the boy from her with the ease of long practice, and Samuel immediately pointed at the horse and said his word with emphasis, and the horse turned its large dark eye toward him with a patience that Fannie had come to think of as the horse's particular affection for the boy. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether we should get a second horse," she said, "for when Samuel is old enough, which will not be for several years, I recognize. But it seems worth thinking about." "It does," Jedediah agreed, looking at his son, looking at the horse with an expression of combined love and amusement that was so entirely characteristic of him that she felt it land in her chest like a warm stone. "And," she said, carefully, watching his face, "about the possibility that Samuel might benefit from not being an only child." The look he turned on her then was the same one he had shown in the kitchen when she had told him about the first time, the same sequence of surprise and overwhelming and quiet, but moving through faster now because he recognized the landscape. "Is that," he said, "a possibility or a statement of fact?" "It is moving from one toward the other," she said. "I wanted to tell you before it had fully arrived." He crossed the small distance between them and put his free arm around her while Samuel observed from his other arm with the serious expression of a child monitoring a development he does not yet have context for, and Jedediah held her against him and said nothing for a long moment. "This is a good life," he said finally. "It is," she said. "It is a very good life." The second child, a daughter they named Clara after no one in particular, but because the name sounded like the quality of the day she arrived, came in November of 1881, on a day when the first snow of the season was sitting on the Kansas ground, and Samuel was watching it from the window with the reverence of a child experiencing something miraculous for the first time. Jedediah brought Samuel in to meet his sister within an hour of her arrival, holding the boy carefully at the bedside where Fannie lay with the new infant. And Samuel looked at Clara with an expression that was 3 parts bafflement and 1 part something that Martha Crane, who was present and had seen a great many of these introductions, said was going to become protectiveness within about a month. She was right. Within a month, Samuel had developed a vigilance around his sister that was both touching and occasionally inconvenient, as the vigilance of toddlers tends to be. That winter was long and deep, and the ranch required all the work that Kansas winters require of ranchers: the constant management of cold and feed, and the welfare of animals in the relentless way that animal husbandry does not permit interruption. Jedediah and Thomas worked in it with the wordless efficiency of men who have learned each other's rhythms, and Fannie managed the house and the children with a competence she had assembled from no single source, but from the aggregate of her own intelligence applied to new problems, which had always been her primary skill. In the evenings when the children were asleep, they sat by the stove and read and talked, and sometimes played cards if they were not too tired, and the warmth of those evenings had a quality that Fannie stored away deliberately, the way you store things you know are valuable and want to be able to find again. And what she stored was not just the warmth of the stove or the lamplight or even the man across from her, but the feeling of herself in it, the feeling of Fannie Morgan, who had spent so many years belonging nowhere, sitting in a room that was entirely hers. Roy Tanner married a widow from Wichita named Helen in the spring of 1882. She was a small, direct woman with a laugh that carried the length of a street, and she took to Roy with the decisive energy of a woman who knows what she wants and is not interested in delay. Fannie liked her immediately and thoroughly. Helen and Roy came to supper at the ranch twice a month through that spring and summer, and the four of them at the table with the children asleep in the back had the specific quality of something Fannie had read about in books and not expected to inhabit, the quality of a circle of people who have chosen each other. Caldwell itself was changing by 1882 in the way all the Kansas cattle towns changed, the cattle trade declining as the Texas fever laws moved the quarantine lines further and further west, and the town shifting from the raw energy of a cattle drive depot toward something slower and more settled. Some businesses closed, others opened. Families who had come for the cattle trade stayed because they had put down roots that were now too deep to move. The town was becoming less a place where people passed through and more a place where people lived. Fannie Morgan Whitaker was one of the people who lived there. She continued her 2 mornings a week at Mrs. Fenwick's lending library, which was now stocking 20 novels and 3 newspapers, in addition to its almanacs and agricultural guides. She had developed, through the slow accumulation of these mornings, a knowledge of the reading preferences of almost every literate person in Caldwell, and used this knowledge with a quiet expertise that Mrs. Fenwick valued and other patrons often did not realize was being exercised on their behalf. She had also, without quite planning it, become someone people came to with problems. Not medical problems and not legal problems exactly, though those categories were fuzzy, but the problems that fall between categories, the problems of who owns what and who said what to whom, and how a person might go about addressing an injustice that does not have an obvious formal mechanism. She was good at these problems because she had long ago learned to understand structures of power and to find the points at which they were navigable, and because she had the kind of patience that comes from having spent years moving carefully through environments where mistakes had significant costs. Jedediah was aware of this and fond of it in the way he was fond of all the particular qualities that made her herself, not with the possessive pride that some men feel toward accomplished women, but with the genuine pleasure of someone who is continually interested in the person they are married to. He told her once, in the way he sometimes told her things, arriving at them sideways after a period of silent consideration, that the thing he was most grateful for in a life that had given him several legitimate things to be grateful for was that she had stepped in front of him in the churchyard on that Sunday. "I would have noticed you eventually," he said. "I had noticed you. But I might have done nothing about noticing." "Why not?" she asked. "Because I had been alone a long time," he said, "and had made a kind of peace with it that was not entirely honest, and you did not give me the option of keeping that peace. You walked directly into my path and asked me something real, and I had to respond with something real. I was desperate, she said. You were, he agreed. But desperation is interesting. It shows you who a person is when all the performative layers have been stripped away. And what I saw when you were desperate was someone I wanted to know when you were not. She thought about this for some time. That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, she said finally. It is an accurate observation, he said. Jedediah, she said, that is still romantic. He smiled, which was a thing his face did less often than most people's, but more fully when it did, and she leaned against him on the bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the evening air and listened to Kansas, which had many sounds if you knew how to hear it. In the summer of 1883, Samuel was 4 years old and Clara was 2, and Thomas had become so thoroughly integrated into the life of the ranch that calling him a ranch hand had stopped being entirely accurate. He was more a member of the household than an employee, eating supper with the family most evenings, teaching Samuel to identify the different grasses and wildflowers in the paddocks, with an encyclopedic knowledge of the prairie that he seemed to have absorbed through the simple fact of paying close attention. He was 21 now, tall and capable, and very quietly in love with a girl in town named Nora Hobbs, whose family had arrived from Illinois the previous autumn, though neither of them had said anything about it to anyone yet in words that were decisive. Fannie was watching this situation with the attentiveness of someone who understands the importance of timing and does not intend to interfere, but is also not inclined to let it get away from negligence. She mentioned it to Jedediah, and he said predictably that Thomas would manage it in his own time. His own time, Fannie said, appears to be moving at a geological pace. Some things require geological patience, Jedediah said. He is 21, she said. He does not have geological time. Jedediah considered this. What would you have us do? Invite Nora Hobbs's family for supper, Fannie said. Just a supper, very ordinary. And Thomas will be there, Jedediah said. Thomas will be there, Fannie confirmed. That is either kind or manipulative, he said. It is both, she said pleasantly. The best things often are. The supper happened. The Hobbs family, who were a practical and cheerful family of 4, came on a Friday evening in August with a rhubarb pie from Mrs. Hobbs that was received with genuine enthusiasm. Nora Hobbs was 18, dark-haired and forthright, and she and Thomas sat next to each other at the supper table and talked with a quality of absorption that was visible enough that Mr. Hobbs noticed it and appeared not to object. Whatever geological process had been occurring sped up considerably after the Friday supper, and by October Thomas and Nora were meeting at church and walking after service with the careful, deliberate air of young people who know they are being observed and do not entirely mind. By the following spring Thomas had asked Mr. Hobbs's permission in the formal way that remained the custom, and Nora had said yes in the definitive way that only women who know exactly what they want can say yes, and there was a wedding planned for June. It was at Thomas and Nora's wedding, sitting beside Jedediah in the same Methodist church where their own wedding had been held 5 years earlier, that Fannie felt the full accumulation of those 5 years settle around her in the warm air. The town around her was not the same town she had arrived in, partly because towns change and partly because the way you see a town changes when it is yours. She could see Roy and Helen in the third pew, Roy's arm around Helen's shoulders, his gray hair catching the window light. She could see Aldous Webb near the back, solid and quiet as a fieldstone. She could see Mrs. Fenwick in her good hat, which she wore for important occasions, and which had 3 small silk flowers on the brim that Fannie had watched the hat maker attach the previous autumn. She put her hand in Jedediah's and felt his fingers close around hers with the ease of a gesture performed 10,000 times and never once grown ordinary. Thomas and Nora were married in the golden light of that June morning, and when they came down the church steps as a married couple, Fannie could see in their faces, in the way they looked at each other and then at the world that had received them into its formal recognition. Something she remembered from her own steps on those same stairs, the feeling of having crossed a threshold that does not go back. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that tested the whole of southern Kansas in the way droughts test everything, with the slow, grinding pressure of scarcity. Jedediah managed the ranch through it with the combination of careful preparation and adapted improvisation that is the only real response to weather on the frontier. There were hard months and lean months and months where the decisions were all compromises between bad options. But the ranch survived, and the family within it did more than survive, because hardship shared by people who have chosen each other has a quality that hardship endured alone does not. Clara was 3 years old and had developed opinions about everything with a thoroughness that her parents found both exhausting and deeply entertaining. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's direct way of looking at the world with them, and she had already demonstrated a gift for getting to the point of things that suggested she would not spend a great deal of her life deferring to people who were wrong. Samuel at 5 was thoughtful and methodical, already capable of being given a task and completing it without further instruction, and had the horses in the corral so thoroughly befriended that Jedediah had stopped worrying about that particular element of ranch safety and redirected his worry, as parents always do, to the next concern. The drought broke in the autumn with 3 weeks of rain that turned the creek running at the east edge of the property, the same creek over whose water rights Delmore Hatch had tried to maneuver 4 years earlier, into a proper stream that ran clear and fast, and made a sound Fannie came to associate with things being restored to what they should be. Delmore Hatch himself had, by the autumn of 1884, become a figure of diminished drama. His land holdings had contracted through the legal settlements and through the ordinary pressures of a changing cattle economy, and while he was still a man of some local substance, the quality of his substance had changed from domination to mere prosperity. He was not a good man, and Fannie did not revise her estimation of him, but he had become a contained rather than an expanding force, and containment was sufficient. He had never directly addressed Fannie again after the courtyard exchange on the day of the injunction. He acknowledged her existence with the minimum required by the social geography of a small town, a nod if their paths crossed, and she returned the same minimum. They had reached the particular equilibrium of people who have a shared history and no shared future. Roy Tanner and his wife Helen had a child in 1884, a boy they named James, and the delight Roy took in this was visible from the outside of any room he was in. He had always been a man of quiet kindness, but fatherhood seemed to have opened some additional chamber in him that radiated a warmth he had previously kept more carefully managed. Fannie watched this with the particular pleasure of someone who has seen a good person given a good thing. In the spring of 1885, when the ranch was in the full productive ease of its 6th year, and Samuel was learning to read with a seriousness that suggested he and Mrs. Fenwick's library were going to have a long and meaningful relationship, and Clara had begun asking questions about why things were the way they were with a frequency that was going to require considerable intellectual stamina from anyone within earshot. Jedediah came in from the east field one afternoon with dirt on his hands and something in his expression that Fannie had not seen before. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the kitchen table where she was working on the accounts, which were her province because she had turned out to have a significantly better head for figures than he did, and she waited because she had learned the particular quality of his silences. "I found something in the east field," he said finally, "under the creek bank where the water cut back in the autumn rains." "What?" He put a small object on the table. It was a metal disc, corroded and old, about the size of a silver dollar, with markings on it that were still partially visible. She picked it up and looked at it. The markings were engraved and showed what appeared to be an eagle or hawk and some symbols she could not read. "Spanish," Jedediah said. "I believe very old." I showed it to Webb, and he thinks it might be from an early expedition. 18th century, possibly. She turned it over. On the other side was a series of marks that she could not interpret. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. "What I was thinking," he said, with the careful approach of a man who has been working out how to say something, "is that this land has a history that goes considerably beyond our 6 years on it, and that the things we think of as new are rarely as new as they seem." "That is true," Fannie said. "Is there more to the thought?" "The more to it is just that I think about that sometimes," he said. "About who else stood on this piece of ground and what they were doing here and whether they knew it was going to be this. Whatever this is. What do you think this is?" she asked. He looked around the kitchen, at the order and warmth of it, at the sound of the children in the yard beyond the window, at her. "Everything," he said. She put the metal disc down on the table between them and reached across and covered his hand with hers and said nothing, because nothing was the right word for what he had said, and she was not going to diminish it with approximation. They kept the disc on the shelf above the kitchen stove, between the tin of tea and the small crack-spine book of poetry that Fannie had bought from Mrs. Fenwick's library 3 years ago, and that she read one poem from, some evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was settling around her. It sat there as a kind of anchor, the oldest object in a young house, a reminder of depth. In the summer of 1886, Jedediah's brother came from Tennessee to visit, the first time they had seen each other in 8 years. His name was Matthew, and he was older than Jedediah by 3 years, and looked like him the way siblings look like each other when they share bones and everything else is their own. He stayed for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks Fannie watched the way the two of them were together, the specific texture of a relationship built on years of shared history, and felt something gentle and slightly complicated. Not envy exactly, but awareness of what it was to have a person in your life who had known you before you were yourself. She had not had that. She had not had a brother or sister, and her mother had known her mostly as a problem to be managed. And there was a whole category of being known that she had simply not had access to and was only now, watching Jedediah and Matthew at the supper table, registering as a category. But then she looked at Samuel watching his uncle with wide-eyed absorption, and at Clara sitting on Matthew's knee after supper, and telling him about the horse she had decided was going to be specifically hers when she was old enough, and at Jedediah watching his brother watch his children, and she understood that the category was being constructed around her even now, the category of being known over time, and that Samuel and Clara would have it in the fullest way, and that this was a thing she had given them. Possibly the most important thing, and it settled something that had been unsettled for years. Matthew Whitaker went back to Tennessee with a photograph of the family that they had all gone to have taken at the photography studio that had opened in Caldwell the previous year. A stiff and formal arrangement in front of a painted backdrop that bore no relationship to their actual life, but that captured their actual faces with a fidelity Fannie found both moving and slightly strange. The way your own face is always slightly strange when you encounter it unexpectedly. She kept a copy of the photograph on the parlor shelf beside a small polished stone that Samuel had brought her from the creek one afternoon, with the gravity of a child presenting a significant gift. The photograph and the stone and the Spanish disc in the kitchen and the poetry book were the artifacts of a life accumulated not by inheritance but by living, and they had an authority that inherited things did not have. In the autumn of 1887, 9 years after Fannie Morgan had stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe railway into the smell of cattle and creosote with $14 and a carpet bag, she sat on the porch of the ranch with the early October light on everything, Jedediah beside her, Samuel doing his reading at the end of the porch with the concentrated seriousness of an 8-year-old, who has recently understood that books are a door into a considerably larger world than the one visible from the porch, and Clara, who was 6 and already moving at a speed that the physical world seemed to find slightly excessive, running through the dried grass at the edge of the yard after something that may or may not have existed. Thomas and Nora were at their own house now, the small house they had built at the edge of the Whitaker property in the second year of their marriage, with a baby named Alice who was 10 months old, and who Nora brought to the main house most mornings while the work of the ranch was done. Thomas was as much a part of the ranch as the water and the grass, and the arrangement that had begun as employment had become something for which employment was entirely the wrong word. Roy and Helen came out from town on Sunday afternoons in the good weather, Roy's limp a little more pronounced now, but his face no less kind. And James, their boy, was 3 years old and had already developed a friendship with Clara based on the shared conviction that running was always preferable to walking. It was a full life. It was not a simple life, because nothing real is simple, and the frontier required things of people that softer environments did not. But it was full in the way that matters, full of people and work and argument and laughter, and the daily renegotiation of a shared existence. And it was rooted in this specific red Kansas earth, under this specific enormous sky, in ways that felt permanent and true. Fannie Morgan Whitaker sat on the porch and watched her daughter run through the dried grass, and felt the particular quality of a Sunday afternoon in a place that is entirely yours, and thought about a woman who had once pressed her face against the glass of other people's, belonging and not known it was possible to be inside. She thought about the Sunday she had walked 6 miles into town in a wool dress and stepped into the path of a stranger and asked him for something real. She thought about the word yes. She thought about all the miles between that $14 and this porch, all the improbable decisions and unlikely alignments and moments of pure desperate courage, and she thought that the distance was extraordinary, and also that every step of it had been somehow necessary, because arriving anywhere worth arriving at requires having genuinely traveled. Jedediah's hand was on the bench beside hers. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held it. Samuel looked up from his book and saw them and went back to his book with the dismissive expression of a child who has witnessed parental affection so many times it has become furniture. Clara came running back from the grass with something in her fist, some treasure, a feather or a stone, and held it up. "Look," she said. "I am looking," Fannie said, and she was.